By sunrise, nearly every truck in town was parked along the dusty road leading to the forgotten 65-acre farm. Farmers leaned against fence posts, reporters adjusted their cameras, and neighbors who hadn't spoken to one another in years stood shoulder to shoulder, staring across the fields in complete silence. No one could believe what they were seeing. 12 months earlier, this same property had been nothing more than an abandoned patch of broken fences, collapsing barns, and neglected soil that everyone insisted was beyond saving. When a young woman signed the papers and became its new owner, the laughter spread through town faster than the news itself. People called it the worst investment anyone had ever made. Some claimed she would abandon it before winter. Others gave her 6 months before bankruptcy forced another auction. Even experienced farmers shook their heads, convinced that determination alone could never repair decades of neglect. Yet now those same people had returned not to mock her, but to witness something they couldn't explain. The fields that once looked lifeless stretched across the horizon in vibrant shades of green. The weathered barn, once ready to collapse, stood proudly against the morning sky. Equipment that had rusted where it sat had somehow returned to working order. Even the old windmill, silent for years, turned steadily in the breeze as if time itself had decided to move backward. No one understood how it had happened. There had been no wealthy investors, no expensive construction crews, and no miracle lottery ticket waiting beneath the soil. She had arrived with little more than determination, practical knowledge, and a willingness to see possibility where everyone else saw failure. Somehow, those qualities had transformed a forgotten farm into the pride of an entire community. People whispered their own theories as they watched. Some believed she'd uncovered hidden wealth buried somewhere on the property. Others insisted a famous agricultural company had secretly financed the restoration. A few simply stood speechless, unable to reconcile what they remembered with what stood before them now. The answer, however, was far more remarkable than any rumor spreading through the crowd. To understand why the entire town came back, we need to go back to the day she first saw the forgotten farm. Her name was Emily Carter, and if you had met her a year earlier, you never would have guessed she would become the owner of one of the most talked about farms in the county. At 36 years old, she had spent most of her adult life working as a landscape designer in a nearby city, helping families create beautiful gardens and outdoor spaces. The work paid the bills, but it never felt like the future she truly wanted. Every evening after long hours surrounded by traffic and concrete, she found herself thinking about the summers she had spent on her grandparents' small farm, where mornings began with birdsong instead of car horns and every day ended beneath an open sky. When her grandparents passed away, that way of life seemed gone forever. Years slipped by, yet the dream of returning to the countryside never disappeared. She quietly saved money, avoided unnecessary debt, and spent weekends reading about soil health, small-scale farming equipment repair, and sustainable agriculture. Friends thought it was an unusual hobby. Emily simply called it preparation. She wasn't wealthy. She had no investors waiting to support her and no famous family name that opened doors. Everything she had came from years of careful saving and countless sacrifices. Buying a successful farm was impossible, but when the neglected 65-acre property appeared at auction for a fraction of its former value, she saw something no one else wanted to see, an opportunity hidden beneath years of failure. The townspeople saw something entirely different. They saw a woman from the city with no commercial farming experience attempting to rescue land that seasoned farmers had already written off. Some believed she would quit after the first harvest failed. Others quietly predicted that the bank would own the property again before the following spring. Even those who wished her well-doubted determination could overcome decades of neglect, failing infrastructure, and exhausted soil. Emily listened without arguing. She knew that proving people wrong rarely began with words. It began with showing up every morning, solving one problem at a time, and refusing to stop when everyone expected you to fail. She signed the papers anyway, collected the old keys from the auction office, and drove toward a place that everyone else had already abandoned. But the farm she purchased had a history that made even experienced farmers stay away. The first time Emily drove through the rusted entrance gate, it was easy to understand why no one else had wanted the property. Nature had slowly reclaimed almost every acre. Waste highweeds covered fields that had once produced healthy harvests, while vines climbed over abandoned machinery as if trying to erase every trace of human effort. Sections of the wooden fence had collapsed into the grass, leaving open gaps where livestock had wandered years before. The main barn leaned noticeably to one side, its faded red paint peeling away beneath decades of harsh winters and scorching summers. Several windows were broken, the roof sagged under missing shingles, and silence filled the air where the sounds of a working farm had once echoed every morning. Older residents still remembered when the farm belonged to the Harrison family, respected farmers who had worked the land for generations. Their crops had supported local markets, and neighbors often gathered there during harvest season. But a combination of severe droughts, rising operating costs, declining crop prices, and mounting debt gradually pushed the family beyond recovery. After the last owner passed away, the property changed hands several times, yet none of the new owners stayed long enough to restore it. Each left behind unfinished repairs, abandoned equipment, and another layer of disappointment until the farm earned a reputation as land that simply refused to reward hard work. Experienced farmers knew another problem lay beneath the surface. Years of poor management had exhausted the soil. Continuous planting without proper crop rotation had drained valuable nutrients, while erosion carried away fertile topsoil whenever heavy rains arrived. Without healthy organic matter, the ground became compacted, making it harder for roots to grow and water to soak into the earth. Restoring farmland like this often requires years of careful planning through cover crops, compost, erosion control, and patient soil rebuilding rather than quick solutions. Standing alone in the middle of the neglected field, Emily looked beyond the broken buildings and overgrown weeds. She noticed the gentle slope that naturally directed rainwater across the property, the mature tree lines protecting the fields from strong winds, and patches of healthy native grasses quietly surviving despite years of neglect. They were small details that most people overlooked, but together they told a very different story. Most people believed the land was beyond saving, but she noticed something everyone else ignored. The excitement of owning the farm disappeared almost as quickly as the first repair bill arrived. Every morning seemed to uncover another problem waiting beneath years of neglect. One section of fencing collapsed after a strong windstorm, forcing Emily to spend days replacing weathered posts instead of preparing the fields. The barn roof leaked whenever rain clouds gathered, soaking tools she could barely afford to replace. An aging tractor refused to start consistently, and every repair demanded money that was already carefully budgeted for seed fuel and basic supplies. Her days settled into an exhausting routine. She woke before sunrise, worked until darkness covered the fields, and often continued repairing equipment beneath a single hanging light inside the old barn. There were no weekends, no holidays, and no shortcuts. Every improvement came through patience, determination, and countless hours of physical labor. Nature offered little sympathy. Heavy spring rains turned sections of the property into thick mud, delaying planting schedules and washing loose soil into nearby ditches. A late frost damaged several young plants she had hoped would become the farm's first successful crop. Each setback reminded her that farming demanded resilience as much as knowledge. Meanwhile, the town continued watching from a distance. Every trip to the hardware store brought quiet conversations that suddenly stopped when she walked through the door. Some people politely wished her luck, while others openly questioned why she refused to admit defeat. They believed the farm was proving exactly what everyone had predicted from the beginning. Emily never argued. Instead, she kept working, solving one problem after another. She repaired gates instead of replacing them, restored old tools rather than buying new ones, and searched constantly for affordable ways to improve the land without creating more debt. Progress remained painfully slow, but each completed task brought the property one small step closer to recovery. Then, during an afternoon spent clearing thick brush near the northern edge of the farm, she noticed something unusual beneath a layer of tangled vegetation. Hidden among broken stones was the outline of an old irrigation channel, carefully built decades earlier but forgotten beneath years of neglect. As she followed its path across the property, she realized it connected nearly every major field. That single discovery completely changed her plan. Instead of seeing the forgotten irrigation channel as another repair project, Emily saw it as the foundation for everything the farm could become. She spent days clearing decades of mud-fallen branches and tangled roots that had blocked the narrow waterway. Piece by piece, the original stone-lined channel began carrying water again, just as it had for generations before being abandoned. The discovery solved one of her biggest problems without requiring expensive machinery or modern infrastructure. She applied the same practical thinking across the rest of the property. Rather than relying on costly chemical treatments, Emily planted nitrogen-fixing cover crops to naturally restore nutrients to the exhausted soil. She spread compost made from local organic materials, repaired drainage where rainwater collected, and rotated planting areas to give tired fields time to recover. Agricultural experts have long understood that healthy soil depends not only on fertilizer, but also on living microorganisms, organic matter, and proper water management. Emily trusted those principles instead of searching for quick fixes. The neglected equipment received similar attention. She carefully dismantled the old tractor that everyone considered worthless, cleaned years of rust from critical components, replaced only the parts that were truly beyond repair, and brought the engine back to life. The familiar sound of its steady motor echoed across the valley for the first time in years, reminding older residents of the farm's better days. Slowly, the landscape began responding to her patience. Fresh grass covered areas that had once been bare. Young crops emerged in neat rows across fields that neighbors believed could never produce again. The repaired windmill pumped water consistently, while restored fencing protected newly planted sections from wandering wildlife. Every improvement seemed small on its own, but together they transformed the farm into something noticeably different. The neighbors couldn't help paying attention. Passing trucks slowed along the roadside. Farmers who had once laughed now paused to study the healthy fields from behind their steering wheels. Some quietly wondered whether they had judged the property too quickly. Others found themselves borrowing ideas from the very woman they had expected to fail. Emily noticed their curiosity but remained focused on the next task waiting in front of her. She understood that real success wasn't measured by compliments. It was measured by consistent progress, one season at a time. By the end of the first growing season, even her biggest critics couldn't ignore what they were seeing. Exactly 1 year after Emily unlocked the old farm gate for the first time, the property looked almost unrecognizable. The neglected fields that had once disappeared beneath weeds now stretched across the landscape in neat rows of healthy crops, their rich green color reflecting months of careful planning rather than expensive shortcuts. Fruit trees that had seemed lifeless produced fresh blossoms, while newly planted pastures swayed gently beneath the summer breeze. What had once been a forgotten corner of the county had quietly become one of its most impressive transformations. The buildings told the same remarkable story. The leaning barn stood straight again after months of careful restoration, its repaired roof protecting tools and harvested crops instead of leaking with every rainfall. Fresh fencing surrounded the fields, repaired gates opened smoothly, and the restored windmill turned steadily above the property as though it had never stopped working. Even the old farmhouse carried signs of new life, with freshly painted walls, clean windows, and flower beds that welcomed every visitor. Word spread quickly beyond the town. Farmers from neighboring counties began driving out simply to see whether the stories were true. Agricultural students visited to study the land restoration methods Emily had used. Local officials praised the project as an example of what patience and practical thinking could accomplish without massive financial investment. As interest grew, property experts estimated that the farm's value had increased dramatically, proving that thoughtful restoration could create lasting value where others had only seen loss. For the people who had laughed a year earlier, however, the greatest surprise wasn't measured in crops or property prices. It was the realization that they had underestimated someone who refused to let doubt define her future. One by one, neighbors approached Emily with genuine respect. Some apologized for their earlier comments. Others simply thanked her for reminding the community that abandoned places sometimes need belief before they need money. Emily accepted every handshake with quiet humility. She never reminded anyone of their criticism because proving them wrong had never been her real goal. Watching the restored field stretch toward the horizon, she understood that true success wasn't about winning an argument. It was about giving forgotten land a second chance to thrive. But the greatest success wasn't the farm itself. The farm transformed far more than abandoned fields and aging buildings. It transformed Emily's life in ways she had never imagined when she first drove through the rusted gate, carrying little more than hope and determination. The long days of uncertainty, the endless repairs, and the quiet moments of doubt had gradually become something much greater than a successful farming project. They became proof that meaningful change rarely happens overnight. It grows through small decisions repeated consistently, even when no one else believes they matter. The town changed as well. Farmers who had dismissed traditional restoration methods began experimenting with healthier soil practices on their own land. Younger families visited the property to learn about sustainable farming, while local schools organized educational tours that taught students how neglected land could be brought back to life through patience instead of expensive shortcuts. Businesses that had once ignored the abandoned property now supported local agricultural projects, inspired by what one determined person had accomplished without wealth or special advantages. Emily never considered herself a hero. She continued waking before sunrise, walking the same fields, checking the same fences, and planning each new season with quiet discipline. Success hadn't changed her character because it had been built on the values she already possessed: hard work, humility, and faith in steady progress. Whenever people praised her achievement, she reminded them that the farm had always contained the potential to recover. Someone simply needed the patience to uncover it. As autumn arrived, the fields glowed beneath the golden light of the setting sun. The restored barn cast a long shadow across healthy crops that swayed gently in the evening breeze. Birds circled above the property, and the windmill turned with the same quiet rhythm that had welcomed generations before her. Emily stood near the old entrance gate and smiled as she remembered the day she first arrived, hearing strangers laugh at the decision that would eventually redefine her future. Looking across the thriving landscape, she realized the greatest opportunities are often hidden beneath years of neglect, waiting for someone willing to see possibility where everyone else sees failure. In the end, it wasn't the forgotten farm that needed saving. It was the belief that impossible things can still become possible through patience, vision, and unwavering determination.